The night was warm for June in the Central Pacific, and the destroyer Milwaukee was running at speed through a sea that had turned black. On her narrow bridge, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood in silence. He was 55 years old. He had been an admiral for 6 years. For the past 6 months, he had commanded the most powerful carrier striking force in the world. 3 hours ago, he had been lowered from the burning bridge of his flagship on a knotted rope. The flagship was called Akagi. She had been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy since 1927. She was 630 feet long. She had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. She had ranged across a third of the Pacific and had not lost a single engagement. Now she was burning on a flat, calm sea 8 miles northeast of his position, and she was dying in a way that suggested she would not stop burning for a long time. Nagumo had not spoken since the transfer. His aide, Commander Nishiyura Susumu, stood 2 paces behind him. The destroyer's captain had offered the admiral his sea cabin. Nagumo had not moved from the bridge wing. He was watching the fire on the horizon. He had been watching it for 3 hours. What he said on that bridge, and what the officers around him said, and what the commanders of the combined fleet said in the hours and days that followed, has been reconstructed from diaries, post-war testimony, and the private correspondence of the men who survived. The official record, the one released to the Japanese public, said something else entirely. The official record said Japan had won. This is what the admirals actually said. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what the admiral said in the night of June 4th, 1942, you have to understand what they believed on the morning of June 4th, 1942. And to understand that, you have to go back further still to the logic that had governed Japanese naval strategy since December 7th, 1941. The logic was not irrational. It was, in fact, the product of careful analysis by some of the finest strategic minds in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The problem was that it had been constructed on an assumption, and the assumption was wrong. The assumption was this: the United States Navy had been dealt a crippling blow at Pearl Harbor. Its battleship line had been destroyed or damaged. Its carriers had survived only by accident. They had been at sea when the attack came. The carrier fleet that remained was numerically inferior to Japan's, operating at the extreme end of its supply lines, and operating under commanders who had not yet demonstrated the willingness to risk their remaining assets in a decisive engagement. Japan, under this analysis, had a window. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, 58 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had been saying since before the war that the window was approximately 12 months. After that, American industrial production will begin to close the gap. The window had to be used. The operation designed to use, it was called MI. The target was Midway Atoll, 2 small islands at the northwestern end of the Hawaiian chain, 1,200 miles from Pearl Harbor. Midway was a runway and a fuel dump and a garrison of Marines. The Americans could not afford to lose it. They would have to send their carriers to defend it. And when the carriers came, Yamamoto's assembled fleet, 200 warships, including 4 Japan 6 fleet carriers, would destroy them. It was a reasonable plan. It had been war-gamed extensively. The carrier force, the Kido Butai, would strike Midway to draw out the American fleet. A second force would intercept and destroy whatever the Americans sent. A third force would land troops to occupy the island. A diversionary force would strike the Aleutian Islands to split American attention. The plan assumed surprise. It assumed that the Americans did not know what was coming. It assumed that the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, would encounter the American carriers only after Midway had been neutralized on terms favorable to Japan, when the Japanese commanders were ready. Every one of those assumptions was wrong. For 1,000 miles east of the Kido Butai, in a basement room beneath the headquarters building at Pearl Harbor, a man named Joseph Rockefort had been working for months on a problem in applied mathematics. Rockefort was 42 years old. He was a commander in the United States Navy. He wore a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers when he worked, which was most of the time. He had not slept in a conventional sense for most of the previous 2 weeks. The problem he was working on was a Japanese Naval Operational Code, designated JN-25. It was a cipher through which the Imperial Japanese Navy transmitted its operational orders. By late May of 1942, Rockefort and his unit, Station Hypo, had broken enough of it to read the outlines of a coming offensive. The target was identified in the traffic only as AF. Rockefort believed AF was Midway. His superiors in Washington were not convinced, so Rockefort arranged a demonstration. He had Midway transmit a plain language message reporting that the atoll's freshwater distillation plant had failed. Within 48 hours, Japanese radio traffic noted that AF was short of fresh water. The argument ended. Admiral Chester Nimitz, 57 years old, commander of the Pacific Fleet, did not hesitate. He had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the Yorktown, which had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and whose repair was estimated to require 90 days. Nimitz gave the yard 72 hours. On June 2nd, Yorktown sailed. Nimitz positioned all 3 carriers northeast of Midway in a square of empty ocean. His staff called Point Luck, and he waited. The Kido Butai sailed into this arrangement without knowing existed. The 4 carriers, their escorting cruisers and destroyers, their air groups of 248 aircraft, and their experienced crews, the men who had bombed Pearl Harbor, who had sunk British warships in the Indian Ocean, who had not lost a fleet carrier in any engagement since the war began, were sailing toward an ambush they could not see. There was one additional factor that no post-war accounting of Midway can omit. On the morning of June 4th, 2 of the most important officers in the Kido Butai were unable to perform their duties. Commander Minoru Genda, 37 years old, was the principal air operations planner of the Pearl Harbor attack. He had spent the years before the war designing the tactical doctrines by which Japanese carrier aviation fought. He was, in the judgment of most of his contemporaries, irreplaceable as an operational mind. On the morning of June 4th, he was in his cabin below Akaji's bridge, burning with pneumonia, drifting in and out of consciousness. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, 39 years old, had led the Pearl Harbor strike. He had transmitted the signal, Tora, 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 that told Yamamoto the attack had achieved surprise. He was the most experienced strike leader in Japanese naval aviation. On the morning of June 4th, he was recovering from emergency appendix surgery performed at sea 3 days earlier. He could not fly. He could barely walk. The 2 officers who understood most precisely what Japanese carriers could do and what they could not do had been removed from the equation before the battle began. At 4 in the morning on June 4th, the Kido Butai turned into the wind. 108 aircraft launched from the 4 carriers, Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, Kate-level bombers loaded with high explosive for the runway at Midway. The strike commander was Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, 31 years old. He lifted off from Hiryu into the pre-dawn darkness and turned southeast. On the bridge of Akaji, Vice Admiral Nagumo and his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryonosuke Kasaka, watched the aircraft disappear and settled in to wait. The sea was empty in every direction. Their search planes were aloft. Their intelligence was current. There were no American carriers within range. Everything they believed was still true. It would remain true for approximately 90 minutes. At 5 in the morning, a problem that had seemed minor became catastrophic. A scout plane assigned to search the northeast sector, the arc of ocean between the Kido Butai and the empty square Nimitz had named Point Luck, had been delayed. The aircraft, Tone's No. 4 Scout, was supposed to launch at 4:30. Its catapult had jammed. Mechanics had worked on it in the darkness. It finally launched at 5, 30 minutes late. The northeast sector, the most important search sector in the entire operation, had been uncovered for 30 minutes at dawn. In those 30 minutes, 3 American carriers had been sitting in that sector. The scout that was supposed to find them had still been sitting on its catapult. No one on Akaji's bridge knew this. The morning continued. At 7, a radio message arrived from Tomonaga. The strike on Midway had gone in. The airfield had been hit, but the runway was not destroyed. The hangars were standing. The defenders had teeth. Tomonaga's 4 words came through the speaker on the bridge of Akaji. There is need for a second attack. On the bridge, Nagumo heard it. Kasaka heard it. They looked at each other. The 93 aircraft held back in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against warships, would have to be rearmed. The correct weapons for a second strike on Midway were land attack bombs, high explosive, good for cratering runways and burning fuel dumps. Torpedoes were for ships. There were no ships. They would change the armament. Below decks, the work began. Torpedoes weighing nearly a ton each were unbolted from their racks. They were rolled into the magazines. Land attack bombs were wheeled out to replace them. Fuel hoses snaked across the hangar decks. The work could not be hurried. It could not be undone halfway through. Then at 7:28, Tone's late-launch scout finally sent its first contact report. 10 enemy surface units northeast. The bridge of Akagi went quiet. 10 ships. In the northeast sector. The empty sector. The sector they had been told was clear. Nagumo asked the only question that mattered. What type of ships? The scout had not said. For 8 minutes, Akagi continued east through a sea that was no longer empty. On the bridge, Nagumo waited. Kasaka waited. The officers around them spoke in low voices. Then at 7:36, the second message arrived. The scout had identified 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. The bridge exhaled. Surface ships. No aircraft. No carriers. The rearming below decks could continue. Then at 8, the third message cut through the speaker. The scout's transmission was brief. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. Nagumo did not move. The young signal officer who carried the written message to the bridge would testify after the war that for several seconds, no one on Akagi's bridge appeared to breathe. Kasaka set his hand against the chart table and did not look at his admiral. A carrier meant aircraft. Aircraft meant the Americans were not 2 days away in Pearl Harbor. They were here. They had been here when Tomonaga's strike launched. They had been here when the first bombs fell on Midway, and they had almost certainly launched already. What Nagumo could not know, what none of the officers on Akagi's bridge could know, was that the aircraft from 3 American carriers were already in the air. They had launched at approximately 6 in the morning. They had been searching for the Kido Butai for 2 hours. The question was no longer whether they would find it. The question was when. Nagumo turned to Kasaka. Were our reserve aircraft? The answer was the worst possible one. Below decks, the 93 aircraft were partially rearmed. Some torpedoes had been removed. Some land attack bombs had been mounted. Some aircraft had been refueled. Some had not. There was no clean state to attack from, and no clean state to retreat to. There was only a hangar full of partially armed aircraft surrounded by ordnance that had been moved out of its magazines and not yet moved back. Nagumo had 3 options. He could launch what he had immediately. Partially armed aircraft, no coordinated strike, minimal fighter escort, land attack bombs that would not penetrate armored flight decks. He could push the reserve aircraft over the side, recover the returning Midway strike, and rearm from scratch. Or he could do what Japanese naval doctrine demanded. Recover the Midway strike, complete the rearming properly, and launch a single overwhelming blow when everything was ready. Kasaka urged a third option. His reasoning was professionally correct. A piecemeal attack on a carrier task force was the most dangerous possible course of action. Carriers had fighter combat air patrols. Partially armed dive bombers attacking without coordination and without proper fighter escort will be destroyed before they reach their targets. Strike with full force when ready. Never piecemeal against carriers. Nagumo gave the order. The reserve aircraft would be properly rearmed. The Midway strike would land first. Everything would be done in sequence. Below decks, the work reversed again. The land attack bombs that had been mounted in the past hour were unbolted and rolled back into the magazines. The torpedoes that had been stowed 40 minutes earlier were dragged out again, hoisted, and bolted back to their racks. Mechanics worked in passages crowded with ordnance. Bombs lay stacked along bulkheads. Torpedoes leaned against elevator shafts. Fuel hoses charged with high-octane aviation, gasoline ran in tangles across the steel deck plates. The Japanese carriers had been designed for speed and aircraft capacity. They did not have armored hangar decks. Their fuel systems were not nitrogen purged the way American systems were. A single spark in a hangar that looked like this: bombs loose, torpedoes loose, fuel lines open, aircraft engines running, would not produce fire. It would produce an event of a different category entirely. If you find the story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Above the carriers, the Combat Air Patrol Zeros had been flying for 90 minutes. They were exhausted. They had chased American torpedo bombers all the way down to wave-top altitude and had been climbing back up to altitude and diving back down again since 9 in the morning. They were running low on ammunition. They had been refueling on the carriers between engagements. They were at 500 feet above the ocean, 14,000 feet above them. The sky appeared empty. The torpedo bombers had come in 3 separate waves, from Hornet, from Enterprise, from Yorktown. They had arrived without coordination, in obsolete aircraft, without fighter escort in most cases, at slow speed against the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, 15 aircraft under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, 42 years old, flew straight and level at 100 knots into the Japanese Combat Air Patrol and the carrier's anti-aircraft guns, and was destroyed in approximately 8 minutes. 15 aircraft launched. 15 aircraft shot down. Of 30 crewmen, 1 survived. Ensign George Gay, 25 years old, who watched the remainder of the battle from the water, holding onto a seat cushion under a piece of floating debris while Japanese destroyers passed within yards of him without noticing. Not one torpedo from any of the 3 torpedo squadrons found a target. 35 of 41 aircraft sent in were shot down. The attack appeared to have failed completely. On the bridge of Akagi, the relief was visible. The torpedo attack had been beaten off. The deck was nearly clear. The Midway strike had been recovered. The reserve aircraft were almost ready. In a matter of minutes, the Kido Butai would launch an overwhelming strike against the American carriers. The most dangerous feeling commander can allow himself, the feeling that the worst is past, was settling over Akagi's bridge. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. At 14,000 feet, the sky was not empty. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, 40 years old, was leading 33 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. He had been flying in the wrong direction for the previous hour. His fuel was critical. His pilots were tired. He had been close to turning back for home when he noticed, far below, the white wake of a single Japanese destroyer moving at high speed on a northerly heading. He guessed it was racing to rejoin the main fleet. He followed it. 20 minutes later, the Kido Butai unrolled beneath him. At the same moment, by a coincidence that historians would spend decades documenting, 17 dauntless bombers from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell, Leslie arrived overhead of Soryu from a different direction. Leslie had lost his own bomb early in the flight due to a faulty electrical arming switch. He led his squadron through anti-aircraft fire toward a carrier he could no longer himself bomb. McCluskey's 2 squadrons had been ordered to divide between Kaga and Akagi due to a miscommunication of his attack signal. Both squadrons pushed over toward Kaga. At the last possible moment, Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing 6, recognized what was happening, pulled out his dive, and took 2 wingmen with him toward Akagi. 28 Dauntless would attack Kaga. 3 would attack Akagi. It would be enough. At 10:10 in the morning, the Japanese lookout screamed. McCluskey's aircraft came down in near-vertical dives from 14,000 feet at 300 miles per hour. Anti-aircraft fire opened up. It was too late, and the angle was wrong. Akagi took 1 bomb amidships. It punched through the wooden flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, where fueled and armed strike aircraft were waiting to be sent topside. The hangar erupted. Fuel lines ruptured. Bombs had been moved in and out of magazines twice in the past 2 hours were sitting loose on the hangar deck. The aviation gasoline stored throughout the ship was connected by fuel lines running through every compartment. The torpedo warheads racked under the reserve aircraft were primed. The secondary explosions did not stop. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, recovering his cabin below, would write after the war that the flames did not simply rise. They climbed 200 feet into the morning sky. The sounds from below the flight deck, he wrote, were unlike anything he had heard in 6 years of naval combat. On the bridge, smoke began pouring up from below. Nagumo did not move. His officers shouted around him. The fire mains had ruptured. Communications were failing. Kosaka eventually took his arm and spoke quietly. "Admiral, The ship is finished. We must transfer command. Nagumo would not leave. He had to be physically restrained by his staff. He had to be lowered down a knotted rope to a waiting launch. The flagship of the Kido Butai was dying beneath him, and he could not make himself leave it. Kaga took 4 bombs in less than 2 minutes. One detonated near the bridge, killing the captain and every officer at his side. More than 800 men would die aboard Kaga. Soryu absorbed 3 direct hits from Leslie's Yorktown bombers within 2 minutes. Her captain, Ryusuke Najimoto, 47 years old, climbed to a position on the bridge, drew his sword, and refused all orders to evacuate. He went down with his ship. The crew that survived had to be pulled from the sea by destroyers that could not approach the burning hull because the paint on their own bulkheads had begun to blister from the radiant heat. 3 carriers, in 6 minutes. All 3 dead in the water. At sea on the destroyer Nowaki, to which he had been transferred, Nagumo would not speak. His aide Nishiura stood behind him and wrote nothing in his notebook. There was nothing to write yet. The battle was not finished. To the north, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been separated from the formation by a rain squall and had not been seen by the American dive bombers. On her bridge, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, 49 years old, had watched 3 columns of black smoke rise from the southern horizon. He understood immediately what they meant. Yamaguchi gave one order: launch everything we have. Hiryu's strike aircraft found Yorktown and put 3 bombs into her. A second strike put 2 torpedoes into her port side. For a brief interval that afternoon, the carrier war appeared to balance. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed. 1 American carrier badly damaged. Listing apparently finished. Then Hiryu's position was found. At 5 in the afternoon, 24 Dauntless from Enterprise pushed over into their dives. 4 bombs hit Hiryu in rapid succession. The last carrier of the Kido Butai became a blazing wreck. On her bridge, Yamaguchi and his captain, Tomio Kaku, also 49, refused all orders to abandon ship. They moved the surviving crew to a destroyer. They returned to the bridge of Hiryu and waited. In the early hours of June 5th, Yamaguchi removed his white peak cap, the cap of a flag officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and handed it to a young staff officer who would survive. He asked the man to give it to his family. Then Yamaguchi and Kaku stood on Hiryu's bridge in the dark and looked at the moon. Survivors watching from the destroyer would remember for the rest of their lives 2 small black figures silhouetted against orange flame, motionless, side by side, as the destroyer Makagumo fired the torpedoes that broke the keel of the last carrier, the Kido Butai. She sank just after sunrise on June 5th. Yamaguchi was 49. Kaku was the same age. 300 miles to the northwest, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in the operations room and listened to a radio that had stopped telling him anything useful. His staff officers stood around the operations table in silence. The chart on the table showed the last known positions of 4 fleet carriers. 3 of those positions were now marked with the small symbols his staff used to indicate ships that were no longer ships. The 4th position, Hiryu, had just been updated. The symbol had been changed. Yamamoto was 58 years old. He had commanded the combined fleet for 11 months. He had designed this operation. He had spent the previous 6 months managing a war machine that had not suffered a significant defeat since December 7th, 1941. He had warned Tokyo before the war began that Japan had at most a year to achieve a decisive strategic victory before American industrial capacity made the outcome inevitable. He had designed Midway specifically to use the remaining months of that window. The window had just closed. His senior operations officer, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, 48 years old, was the first to speak. He proposed the only action remaining, pursuit. Yamato could make 27 knots, a night surface action with battleships and cruisers, close the Americans in the dark, and finish them before dawn. Captain Kamito Kurishima, 49, Yamamoto's senior planning officer, unrolled a fresh chart across the table. Kurishima was an unusual figure even in a navy that tolerated eccentrics. He worked alone for days at a time. He chain-smoked. He had been one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor operation. Now he looked at the geometry of the ocean east of Midway and worked the numbers aloud without being asked. The American carriers. If Spruance chose to withdraw, and Kurashima said flatly that Spruance would choose to withdraw, could make 30 knots. Every hour of pursuit widened the gap, and at first light, wherever pursuit ended, Spruance would have the same dive bombers that had killed 4 fleet carriers in 6 minutes. The arithmetic was finished before Kurashima set his pencil down. Yamamoto knew it. Watanabe knew it. Kurashima had known it before he started drawing. But the order for pursuit was given anyway. Warships across hundreds of miles of the Central Pacific were directed to converge on the American task force at maximum speed. The invasion transports, still carrying 5,000 soldiers toward an island that would not be invaded, were ordered to reverse course. Then, shortly before midnight, the radio intelligence summary arrived in the operations room. The document was routine in format. It compiled intercept analysis from the previous several weeks. Buried inside it, toward the end, was a conclusion the staff had been avoiding all evening. American radio traffic indicated that the United States Navy had not merely estimated the general outlines of the Midway operation. It had known the composition of the strike force, the axis of approach, the date, the role of the Aleutian diversion, the intended sequence of the operation. The Japanese naval code had been broken. Not recently. For months. The operations room was quiet for a long time. Captain Kurashima did not reach for another cigarette. Watanabe did not speak. Outside the armored bulkheads of the operations room, the Yamato's engines drove 72,000 tons of steel east through a black sea toward an enemy that already knew it was coming. Yamamoto was the first to speak, according to Watanabe's post-war account. What he said was not recorded verbatim. What Watanabe remembered was that Yamamoto asked one question, a quiet question. He asked how long. Watanabe understood what was being asked. Not how long had the code been broken. How long had the Americans known? And the answer, worked backward through the traffic analysis and the intelligence summary, was at minimum several months, possibly since spring, possibly longer. Every operation the combined fleet had conducted since the beginning of the year had been conducted inside a room where the Americans could hear every word. 2 decks below the operations room, Commander Minoru Genda was finally awake. His fever had broken. He had been told the basic facts an hour earlier by a staff officer who had kept his voice carefully neutral. Now, Genda turned to the officer beside him and asked a question that would define the remainder of his career and the remainder of his life. Did they know we were coming? The officer did not answer. He did not have to. At 2:55 on the morning of June 5th, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto signed the order canceling the Midway operation. The order was 3 sentences long. It directed the invasion convoy to withdraw. It directed the striking force to retire to the northwest. It terminated the operation. It was signed in Yamamoto's hand. It was transmitted to the fleet. It was the first order of retreat the combined fleet had received since the war began. In the hours that followed, the 4 burning carriers continued their slow deaths. Kaga had capsized during the night of June 4th, taking more than 800 men down with her. Soryu had slipped beneath the surface late on June 4th. Her captain went with her. On June 5th, Yamamoto ordered destroyers to scuttle Akagi before American aircraft could photograph her still afloat. Japanese torpedoes went into the hull of the flagship that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack. She sank in deep water. Hiryu lasted through the night. As the sky began to lighten on June 5th, Yamaguchi and Kaku were still on her bridge. The destroyer Makagumo fired her torpedoes and turned away. Hiryu sank just after sunrise. The retreat tried to kill him again before it was over. Heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma had been part of a support group ordered to bombard Midway's airfield before the cancellation order came through. They received the abort in the middle of the night. They turned northwest. In the pre-dawn darkness, a lookout spotted the periscope wake of the American submarine USS Tambor. The formation made an emergency turn. Most ships executed it correctly. Mogami did not. Her bow drove into Mikuma's port side at 28 knots. Both ships were crippled. Mikuma's fuel tanks ruptured. Heavy oil began streaming behind her in a long dark ribbon across the surface of the ocean. A patrol aircraft out of Midway found the slick. Dive bombers followed the trail. On the afternoon of June 6th, aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet put 5 direct hits into Mikuma. She capsized that evening, taking more than 700 men down with her. Mogami, struck by 6 bombs, survived and limped back across the Pacific. She would spend a year in dry dock. She was never again the ship she had been. By June 6, the complete picture was available to Yamamoto's staff. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser sunk, a second permanently crippled, more than 240 aircraft, and 3,057 men, among the more than 100 veteran aircrew whose years of training could not be repeated inside the war that remained. The United States had lost the carrier Yorktown, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine 2 days after the battle, while under tow 145 aircraft and 307 men. On paper, an asymmetric exchange. In reality, the asymmetry ran far deeper than any tally. American shipyards were already laying the keels of the Essex-class fleet carriers. By 1944, those yards would give the United States Navy more carriers in commission than every other navy in the world combined. Japan's largest yards could build 1 fleet carrier in approximately 18 months under optimal conditions. Those conditions no longer existed. The steel was running short. The pilots could not be replaced at the rate they were being lost. The code had been read for months. The assumption of strategic surprise on which the entire Pacific War had been planned was gone. Yamamoto understood this. He said so privately to Watanabe and to his flag secretary in the days after the battle. He did not say it publicly. He could not say it publicly. What he said publicly was nothing, because there was no public statement, because there was no public acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong. On June 10, 1942, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo issued a communiqué. The communiqué announced a great victory at Midway. 2 American carriers had been sunk. The announcement said, 150 American aircraft destroyed. Japan had lost 1 carrier of its own, with a second damaged. The announcement did not name the carrier. It did not name Akagi. It did not name Kaga. It did not name Soryu. It did not name Hiryu. 3 of the 4 carriers that had been resting on the bottom of the Pacific for 6 days were not mentioned. Mikuma was not mentioned. Tomonaga was not mentioned. Yanagimoto was not mentioned. Yamaguchi and Kaku, standing motionless against the orange flame on Hiryu's bridge, were not mentioned. The newspapers ran the official text without correction. The families of the dead were not informed of what had happened. Surviving sailors were placed in isolated barracks and forbidden to write home. They were forbidden to mention the names of their ships. They were forbidden to speak of what they had seen. Some were rotated through quiet shore postings. Others were sent to remote garrisons where their silence would eventually be made permanent. The men who had watched 4 fleet carriers burn in a single day were being managed the way dangerous information is always managed. They were separated from anyone who might listen. Commander Gendo was transferred to a staff position. He recovered from his pneumonia and returned to work and said nothing publicly about Midway for the remainder of the war. Fukuda, recovering from his appendix surgery, eventually walked out of the hangar deck of Akagi under his own power while the ship was still burning. He was one of the last men off. He would carry Burns in the memory of what he had seen for the rest of his life, in private. In the correspondence and diaries that would not be read until after surrender, the surviving officers were more direct. Kusaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, wrote in his diary that night that the rearming decision had been correct by every standard of doctrine and training, and that doctrine and training had been built for a different kind of war. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The sentence contained everything. A junior officer aboard one of the escort cruisers, his name was withheld from the account in which his words appear, wrote to his wife 2 weeks after battle that he had watched the smoke from 4 carriers rising together from a flat sea and had understood in that moment that something had ended which could not be repaired. He told her not to worry. He told her the war was still going well. He then spent 3 pages explaining, in careful detail that contradicted the reassurance, exactly what he had seen. Yamamoto said almost nothing on record. What he said to his inner circle was reconstructed from their post-war accounts. What emerges from those accounts is not a man in shock. It is a man who recognized the shape of something he had feared for a long time and was now looking at it directly, before the war. In a letter written in January of 1941 to the Navy minister, Yamamoto had warned that Japan should not fight the United States. He had written that he had no confidence in a protracted conflict. He had written that an initial period of victories might be achieved, but that the long-term arithmetic was unfavorable. He had been overruled, and then he had designed Pearl Harbor as the best available option inside a war he believed would be lost. Midway did not surprise him in the way it surprised his staff officers. It confirmed what he had been managing since December 7th. The question was no longer whether Japan could win. The question was how long the losing could be sustained, and whether some position, some negotiated outcome, some material fact on ground, could be preserved before the ending came. He gave the order for pursuit on the night of June 4th, knowing pursuit would fail. He signed a cancellation order before 3 a.m. He returned to his operations room and continued working. There was still a war to fight. The code had been broken, but the war had to be fought anyway, and the fleet had to be rebuilt, and the pilots had to be replaced, and the factories had to keep producing, and somewhere in the logic of all that continuing effort was a possibility, diminishing but not yet zero, that something could be salvaged. 10 months later, on April 18, 1943, 1 year to the day after the Doolittle raid had bombed Tokyo and embarrassed the Imperial Navy, Admiral Yamamoto flew on an inspection tour of forward air bases in the Solomon Islands. The same code-breaking apparatus that had read the Midway plan read the itinerary for flight. 18P 38 Lightning fighters lifted off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal before dawn, flew 435 miles at wave-top altitude over open ocean, and intercepted Yamamoto's bomber over the jungle of southern Bougainville. His body was found at the crash site the following day. His gloved hand was resting on the hilt of his sword. Japan announced his death in May and declared a day of national mourning. The official announcement attributed his death to combat operations in the forward area. It did not mention that the Americans had read his flight schedule. The code-breaking machinery that had set the trap at Midway had simply continued to run. Nagumo survived Midway. He was relieved of carrier command and given administrative assignments. By 1944, he commanded the Central Pacific Area Fleet, a designation that had grown increasingly theoretical as American forces moved through the island chains. In June of 1944, American forces landed on Saipan. Nagumo's headquarters was on Saipan. He had 13,000 troops to defend an island being attacked by a Marine division. The battle lasted 3 weeks. By the evening of July 6, 1944, American Marines were within a mile of Nagumo's command post in a cave in the hills above Garapan. The battle was finished. The island was lost. The empire he had served for 40 years was hours from losing the Marianas Chain entirely, which would put American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands and make the eventual end not a matter of strategic analysis, but a matter of arithmetic. Nagumo was 57 years old. He had been an admiral for 8 years. He had commanded the force that bombed Pearl Harbor. He had stood on the bridge of Akagi when the first message from Tone's late scout came through. He had made the decision to rearm. He had made the decision to recover the strike before launching. He had been lowered from Akagi's burning bridge on a knotted rope 2 years and 1 month before. According to his aide, who survived, his last words were not about Saipan. They were not about the war. They were not about the empire. He said, "I should have died on Akagi." Then he was gone. The official Japanese communiques continued until August of 1945. They continued to describe victories and successful defensive operations and enemy losses exceeding Japanese losses. The format established on June 10, 1942 did not change. The language did not change. The assumption that the public could not be trusted with the actual arithmetic did not change. What changed was the arithmetic itself, which continued in only one direction. The sailors who had been isolated in barracks after Midway and forbidden to write home eventually went back to the war in other ships and other assignments. Some survived. Some did not. The ones who survived carried what they had seen on June 4th, 1942, in silence for the remainder of the war, and in many cases for years afterward. The culture they served did not encourage the kind of accounting that Midway required. What the admirals actually said in diaries, in private correspondence, in post-war testimony collected by Allied investigators after surrender, was different from what the communique said. It was different from what the newspapers printed. It was different from what the isolated sailors were forbidden to contradict. What the admirals actually said was this: the trap had been real. The code had been read. The northeast sector had been uncovered for 30 minutes by a catapult that jammed. The rearming decision had been correct by doctrine, and doctrine had been built for conditions that no longer existed. The 4 carriers had died not because the commanders were incompetent, but because the assumptions underlying every decision of the morning had been wrong before the first aircraft launched. Kusaka said it. Genda said it in the post-war accounts he eventually gave to historians. The junior officers said it in letters they had written and hidden and eventually showed to researchers decades later. The arithmetic of Midway was not contested by the men who had lived it. They understood it clearly. They had understood it by nightfall on June 4th. The lie, the communique, the isolated barracks, the forbidden letters, the 3 carriers whose names disappeared from the official record, was not constructed because the admirals did not understand what had happened. It was constructed because they understood exactly what had happened, and because the gap between what had happened and what the Empire required the public to believe was, by the evening of June 4th, 1942, already too wide to bridge with anything except silence. The carriers went down in deep water. The pilots could not be replaced. The code kept being read. The trap at Midway did not end the war on June 4th, 1942. It simply established a direction in which the remaining 3 years would run. And on the night of June 4th, 300 miles to the northwest, aboard a battleship that was already turning back from pursuit it could never complete, an admiral sat in his operations room and knew all of this and signed a cancellation order anyway, and went back to work, because there was still a war to fight and no way to stop fighting it. And the ending he predicted in January of 1941 was now simply a matter of time. The time was 3 years. Almost of the day. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.